Imagine working for years at a company, doing everything right, only to be told you're fired without warning. That's exactly what happened to John. But what came next shocked everyone, even his boss. 7 minutes after being fired, John gets a call that changes everything. But here's the twist. It's not just about his job anymore. Something much bigger is happening behind the scenes, and John's about to find out he's not just a victim in this game. He might be the key to it all. Stay tuned to find out how one decision could turn his life upside down. Before we start the story, comment below and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more upcoming videos. John had always considered himself a dedicated worker. He had been with ABC Corp for nearly 5 years, showing up every day on time, never complaining, and always going the extra mile. While he wasn't the loudest or most outspoken person in the office, he made sure his work was done right. His colleagues respected him, and his boss, Mr. Carter, always seemed to appreciate his quiet professionalism. Or so John thought. The truth was, John never really understood the kind of person Mr. Carter truly was. He'd always thought the boss was just strict, someone who pushed his employees hard, but at least respected hard work. However, that morning, as John walked into Mr. Carter's office for what seemed like an ordinary meeting, he would learn the shocking truth. Little did John know, this meeting would change the course of his entire life in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. The words that came out of Mr. Carter's mouth next would leave John standing there in disbelief, struggling to understand what was happening. "John, we need to talk," Mr. Carter said, his voice stern as he gestured for John to sit down. John had been summoned to the office many times before, but this felt different. There was a coldness in the air that made his stomach twist with unease. As he sat across from his boss, he noticed Mr. Carter wasn't looking at him with his usual calculated indifference. No, today there was something colder about him, something distant. John hadn't expected this. Just the day before, he'd stayed late to finish up a project that he knew was critical to the company's new client. He'd worked through lunch, missed the company-wide meeting, and even skipped his usual walk to the coffee shop to get the report perfect. So, when Mr. Carter finally spoke again, John's heart sank. "Your performance lately," Mr. Carter continued, his eyes narrowing, "hasn't been up to standard. I've noticed some mistakes in your work, small ones, but they add up. And frankly, I can't afford to have someone on the team who isn't pulling their weight." John's mind raced. Mistakes? What mistakes? He had double-checked everything. He thought of all the late nights, the early mornings, the weekends spent working on projects that no one else cared about. To hear this now, after all that effort, felt like a punch to the gut. Mr. Carter paused, looking at John with a piercing gaze. "It's not just about the mistakes," he said, leaning forward slightly. "It's about your attitude. You've been getting too comfortable. Maybe it's time you moved on." John blinked, trying to process the words. "Move on?" he repeated, almost as if the phrase didn't belong in the same sentence as his name. "What do you mean, Mr. Carter? I've been with this company for 5 years. But Mr. Carter cut him off, his voice sharper now. "I'm sorry, John, but I've made my decision. You're fired, effective immediately." The words hit John like a freight train. Fired? His mind couldn't wrap around it. He sat there in stunned silence, his mouth dry, his thoughts racing. Fired? Just like that? There had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe Mr. Carter was joking, though John couldn't remember the last time his boss had shown any sense of humor. Maybe this was just some strange test, a sick joke. But looking into Mr. Carter's cold, unblinking eyes, John realized it wasn't a joke. His boss wasn't kidding. John stood up slowly, feeling the blood rush to his head. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain, to beg for another chance, but the words wouldn't come. He was too stunned to speak. Instead, he just nodded, his mind numb with disbelief. He turned to leave the office, his heart racing, feeling as though the floor was giving way beneath him. As he stepped out of the office, The sound of Mr. Carter's voice calling after him faded into the distance. "I'll have someone escort you out," Mr. Carter had said. That was it. The door had closed behind him, leaving him alone in the hallway, the weight of the situation sinking in. John's hands were trembling. How could this be happening? John walked out of the office in a daze, his mind a blur of confusion, anger, and disbelief. His thoughts were racing, but none of them made sense. He had never expected this, not in a million years. Fired? For what? A small mistake in a report? That couldn't be the real reason. Maybe Mr. Carter had something personal against him. John had always been a bit quieter than the rest of the team, but he had always thought that didn't matter. Hard work spoke for itself, didn't it? He reached his desk, his legs weak as he sat down in his chair, the weight of the situation finally starting to settle in. He stared at the screen in front of him, seeing nothing but the reflection of his own stunned face. How was he supposed to tell his wife? They had just bought a house. His son had started kindergarten a few weeks ago. He couldn't just walk in the door and say, "I'm fired." He needed this job. He pulled out his phone, the tremor in his hands making it difficult to unlock it. The screen lit up and he saw a text from his wife. "How did the meeting go? Can't wait to hear about the new project." John stared at the message for a long moment. He wanted to reply, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth, not yet. Instead, he typed a quick response. "It went well. I'll call you in a bit." He set the phone down, his mind spinning. A part of him wanted to storm back into Mr. Carter's office, demand an explanation, ask for his job back. But deep down, he knew that wasn't going to work. Mr. Carter had made up his mind. There was no going back, and that thought settled like a heavy stone in John's chest. He had nothing. As John sat there, the minutes felt like hours. He was just about to grab his things and leave when his phone rang. It wasn't his wife. It wasn't a colleague. The caller ID showed an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment, then answered. "Hello?" A voice on the other end spoke quickly. "John, it's Mark from HR. I need you to come down to my office right now. We've got a situation." John's heart skipped a beat. HR? He didn't even know why they would need to talk to him. Maybe they wanted to go over the details of his severance or something. He didn't care. At this point, it didn't matter. He just needed to leave. But then Mark's next words stopped him cold. "John, this is really important. You need to come now. It's about your job." Something in the way Mark said that made John's stomach twist. It wasn't the tone of someone giving bad news. It was urgent, almost like something unexpected was about to happen. John grabbed his things, barely noticing that his hands were still shaking. His mind couldn't focus. He couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was going on. He walked quickly toward the HR office, his thoughts racing even faster. What could this be about? John reached the HR office in record time. His steps hurried but unsteady, as if his legs were moving without his permission. The door to Mark's office was slightly ajar, and as John stepped inside, Mark was already on the phone. He glanced up briefly, his eyes widening as he saw John, and then quickly motioned for him to take a seat. "Hold on a second," Mark said into the phone, and then he hung up, giving John a quick nod. "Thanks for coming so fast. I wasn't sure you'd want to hear this, but I think it's time we clear things up." John sat down, still unsure what was happening. He could barely remember the last few minutes. His mind kept replaying the moment Mr. Carter fired him, how everything seemed to freeze in place like the world had stopped spinning for a few seconds. It felt like a bad dream. Mark's expression was serious, but there was something else in his eyes, a glimmer of urgency that John couldn't quite place. Mark leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a lower, more confidential tone. "Look, John, I don't know how to say this, so I'll just get straight to the point. Mr. Carter, he's made a mistake." John blinked, thinking he had misheard. "A mistake? What do you mean? He fired me, I know," Mark interrupted quickly. "And I know it doesn't make sense. You were just in his office, right? And he told you he was letting you go. John nodded, still stunned. The thing is, that decision was made without the proper approval. Mr. Carter doesn't know this, but the company has been planning a major promotion for you. That was all set up before he made his decision today. John's head spun. A promotion? He had been working here for years, but he had never been told anything about a promotion. Wait, what? I don't understand. If I was supposed to get promoted, then why did he fire me? Mark sighed, sitting back in his chair. Because Mr. Carter, well, he's been pushing people out of his department. He's been trying to downsize without anyone noticing. But you're part of a bigger plan, one that he doesn't even know about yet. You were about to get a new role, John, a much better one. John's mouth went dry. He wanted to say something, to ask more questions, but his mind couldn't keep up with everything Mark was saying. A promotion? For him? It didn't make sense. And yet, as Mark spoke, John couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut, the feeling that something bigger was unfolding here, something he hadn't seen coming. Mark continued, his voice low but firm. I've been told to keep this quiet for now, but things are about to change and Mr. Carter won't be happy when he finds out. You're not being let go, John. You're about to be placed in a new role, and it's going to be a big one. But for now, we need to keep this under wraps. Just trust me, okay? John could hardly process what he was hearing. The idea of being promoted seemed so out of reach just a few hours ago, but now it was staring him in the face. He was being given a chance, an opportunity that no one else knew about, not even Mr. Carter. But the most confusing part? Why had Mr. Carter fired him if the promotion was already in the works? Mark seemed to read his mind. I know it sounds crazy, but the truth is Mr. Carter is making some decisions that are questionable. You don't deserve to be in that situation. You didn't know it, but you've been selected for something bigger. It's just that Carter is in the dark about all of this, and he made a mistake. He doesn't know what's coming. John sat there, his head spinning. Everything he thought he knew about his job, about his boss, had been completely turned upside down. And yet, in the back of his mind, a nagging thought remained. If this was true, if he was about to get a promotion, why was Mr. Carter acting so cold? Why hadn't anyone told him? And why, after everything he had done, did it all seem to hang by a thread? John took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. So, what now? He asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Mark's lips curled into a half-smile, though there was no amusement in his eyes. Now, we wait, and let things unfold. But trust me, John, things are going to get interesting. John's mind raced as he left Mark's office. Nothing made sense anymore. The sudden switch from being fired to learning he was about to be promoted felt like whiplash. His head was spinning, and he couldn't figure out how to process all this new information. He knew he had to talk to his wife, but right now, there was just too much uncertainty to put into words. He needed answers. He needed to figure out how all of this fit together. As he walked back to his desk, his thoughts were interrupted by a quick tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Claire, one of his co-workers, standing there with a worried look on her face. Hey, John, you okay? She asked. Her voice was gentle, but there was concern in her eyes. I saw you leave Mr. Carter's office. Is everything all right? John hesitated for a moment. He wanted to tell her what had just happened, to share the absurdity of being fired and then learning about a promotion, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. Instead, he just nodded and gave her a half-smile, trying to reassure her. Yeah, everything's fine, he said, though it didn't feel fine at all. Claire didn't seem convinced. You sure? You've been here forever. It just seems weird, you know? Mr. Carter's been acting strange lately. People are talking. John's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what Claire was talking about, but something in her tone made him want to know more. What do you mean, acting strange? He asked, lowering his voice. She glanced around quickly, making sure no one else was listening. I don't know if you've noticed, but he's been making a lot of weird decisions lately. Firing people without warning, moving people around. It's almost like he's clearing the way for something, or someone. I don't know, John. Something's off. John felt a chill run down his spine. Was Mr. Carter really trying to clean house? But then why had John been targeted? And why had Mark said what he did? Why was he being set up for something big while his boss seemed to be running his own agenda behind the scenes? Before John could respond, Claire seemed to notice his distracted look and quickly changed the subject. Anyway, just take care of yourself, okay? You've got a lot of people here who appreciate you, even if Carter doesn't see it. She gave him a quick smile, then walked away, leaving John standing there, more confused than ever. He returned to his desk and sat down, his mind a whirlwind of questions. There had to be more to this story. Mark had made it clear that Mr. Carter was unaware of the promotion, but if Claire's suspicions were right, it sounded like something was happening behind the scenes that no one was supposed to know about. And why had Mr. Carter acted so coldly toward him earlier? Was it really just about a mistake on a report, or was there more to it? As John sat there staring at his computer screen without really seeing it, the door to the office opened. He didn't look up immediately, but then he heard the unmistakable sound of Mr. Carter's footsteps coming toward his desk. John's heart skipped a beat, and he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The last time he had seen his boss, Mr. Carter had been firing him without a second thought. What could he possibly want now? John. Mr. Carter's voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. I need to speak with you. John looked up, his hands suddenly feeling clammy. His mind was still racing, but he knew he couldn't avoid this conversation. Whatever was happening, it was happening now. Mr. Carter's eyes were cold, just as they had been in the meeting. Follow me, he said, his voice firm. John hesitated for just a moment, but then he stood up and followed Mr. Carter out of the office, a sinking feeling growing heavier in his chest. He had no idea what to expect, but he knew one thing for sure. The last time he walked down this hallway, his world had been turned upside down. Now, it seemed like the story was far from over. They walked in silence down the hall, and with every step, John's anxiety grew. What could Mr. Carter possibly want now? After everything that had just happened, after being fired and then learning about a promotion he hadn't even known about, John was on edge. Every nerve in his body was firing, and his thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and frustration. They reached Mr. Carter's office, and John was motioned inside. The door clicked shut behind him, and for a moment there was only the sound of the low hum of the air conditioning. Mr. Carter didn't sit down. Instead, he stood at the window, his back to John, staring out at the city skyline, his posture stiff, like he was lost in thought. John felt his stomach churn. This wasn't the same man he had known for the past 5 years. There was a tension in the room now that made everything feel different, unnerving, almost. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mr. Carter turned around, his gaze locked onto John. You're probably wondering why I called you back in here, he said, his tone colder than ever. John didn't know how to respond. He wasn't sure if he should be angry, confused, or scared. The whole situation felt surreal, like a bad dream. He had to force himself to speak. I don't understand. You fired me earlier, Mr. Carter. I don't know what happened. What's going on? Mr. Carter's lips tightened, and for the first time John saw a flicker of something other than cold detachment in his eyes. Was it guilt? Regret? It was hard to tell. Look, John, Mr. Carter started, his voice softer now, but still with that edge of authority. I know this situation doesn't make sense, but you have to understand, it wasn't personal. I had to make a decision quickly, and, well, you're not the only one who's been affected by these changes. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I had no choice. It wasn't about you as a person, but about the company's direction. John listened, but the words felt hollow. This wasn't the same man who had fired him just hours ago. This wasn't the man who had told him he wasn't good enough anymore, that his work wasn't up to par. John wasn't buying it. Then why? John started. But Mr. Carter raised his hand, silencing him. Because the company is moving in a new direction. There's been restructuring, and I've been under pressure to downsize my department. I wasn't given any choice but to make cuts. Mr. Carter's eyes darted to the side as if he was trying to avoid John's gaze. I made a mistake, okay? Firing you was a mistake, and I need to fix it. John felt his breath catch in his throat. Was this some sort of apology, or was it just damage control? What do you mean, fix it? John asked, his voice low. He wasn't sure if he was ready to hear the answer. Mr. Carter's jaw tightened. He walked around his desk, leaning against it, his hands clasped together in front of him. I didn't know about the promotion, he said, his voice growing more tense. The higher-ups had already planned it. They wanted you to move up, John. But I didn't know that. I acted without thinking. His voice softened just a bit, but the sharpness remained. I made a decision I shouldn't have made, and now I need to fix it. You were supposed to be promoted to a much better position, a role with more responsibility, more recognition. John stared at him in disbelief. A promotion? A better role? But Mr. Carter had just fired him. He couldn't reconcile the two. The words felt like they didn't belong in the same sentence. So what does this mean for me? John asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Carter paused for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke, his words clipped but with a certain finality. It means that I'm going to reinstate you. I'm going to make sure that you're placed in the position that was meant for you. And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're set up for success. But I need you to understand something, John. Things are going to change around here, and they're going to change fast. If you're going to stay, you need to be prepared for what's coming. John felt his head spin. A promotion, reinstatement, and now this. What's coming? He asked, his voice tense. Mr. Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked back to the window, staring out again, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with meaning. There's more going on than you realize, and if you're going to be part of this, you need to be ready for the ride. This is bigger than just your promotion, John. There are things happening behind the scenes that you don't know about, and once you're back in, you'll have a front row seat to everything. John felt a shiver run down his spine. What kind of changes was Mr. Carter talking about? What had he gotten himself into? He didn't know if he was ready for any of this. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. John left Mr. Carter's office with more questions than answers, his mind in a complete fog. His head was still spinning from the conversation. A promotion that was supposed to be his. Mr. Carter admitting he made a mistake. A company restructuring that no one had bothered to tell him about. And now, this cryptic warning about things changing. What was that supposed to mean? He walked down the hallway, his footsteps heavy, his thoughts tangled. Everything felt like it was happening too fast. 1 minute he was being shown the door, and now he was being handed a promotion he didn't even know existed. But none of it felt real. It all felt like a setup. He didn't trust Mr. Carter. John had been loyal to that man for years, and now, just hours after firing him, Mr. Carter was telling him he had a bigger role in store. Something didn't add up. If Mr. Carter really had his best interests at heart, why hadn't he told him about the promotion earlier? Why hadn't anyone else mentioned it? Why wait until he was practically out the door before revealing it? John's thoughts were interrupted when his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, already knowing who it was. His wife's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment, he hesitated. How was he supposed to explain all of this to her? She had no idea what was going on, and after everything that had just happened, he didn't even know where to start. He swiped the screen and answered. Hey, hon. John. Are you okay? Sarah's voice came through, laced with concern. You said the meeting went well, but you sound off. What's going on? John took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. Yeah, it's complicated. Look, I'll explain everything when I get home. Just don't worry, okay? I'm fine. He tried to sound calm, but even he could hear the uncertainty in his voice. John, what happened? She pressed. You're scaring me. You've never sounded like this before. Are you sure you're all right? John felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He hated lying to her, but right now he couldn't share the full truth. There was too much to explain, and it was all so confusing. How could he tell her that he had been fired, but then somehow found out he was about to get promoted? How could he tell her that everything was changing in ways neither of them could understand? "Look, Sarah," he said, his voice more forceful now, trying to steady himself. "I promise I'll tell you everything tonight. I just need some time to figure it all out, okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then she spoke again, her voice softer. "Okay, but don't keep me in the dark, John. Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out together." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He knew she was trying to be supportive, but right now, all he wanted was to understand what was happening to him, to them, to everything he thought he knew. "Thanks, Sarah. I'll be home soon," he said, his voice tight. After hanging up, John stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in his hand. The hallway around him felt strangely quiet. The world seemed to be moving around him, but he was standing still, stuck in this whirlwind of uncertainty. He had no idea what Mr. Carter meant by things changing, but he had a sinking feeling that the changes weren't going to be as simple as just a promotion. He was already a part of something bigger, something he hadn't even begun to understand. And if there was one thing he knew for sure, it was that his life was about to take a turn he hadn't seen coming. He turned and walked toward the exit, his mind still racing. The door to the office building opened in front of him and he stepped outside, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. For a moment, he closed his eyes, trying to steady himself. The world hadn't stopped spinning, but he wasn't sure he was ready for what was coming next. As John drove home, his mind kept circling back to the same question. Why had Mr. Carter fired him in the first place? And more importantly, what was really happening behind the scenes at ABC Corp? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was caught in the middle of something far bigger than just a simple office politics game, something darker. And he had a feeling that whatever it was about to catch up with him. By the time John arrived home, the weight of the day had settled on him like a heavy blanket. The familiar sights of his street, his house, everything felt distant, almost unreal. He parked the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. His mind kept replaying what Mr. Carter had said, the unsettling way he had spoken about the changes at the company, and the cryptic mention of things getting interesting. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he was being pulled into something much bigger than he could handle. Inside, the house was quiet. Sarah wasn't in the living room like usual, so John assumed she was in the kitchen, probably getting dinner ready. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. There was no easy way to explain this to her. How do you tell your wife that you were fired, then reinstated, and now might be part of something far bigger than a promotion? "John?" Sarah called out from the kitchen. Her voice broke through his thoughts. "Is everything okay? You've been quiet since you got here." He walked toward the kitchen, taking one more deep breath. Sarah was standing by the stove, stirring something in a pot. Her face lit up when she saw him, but there was still a trace of concern in her eyes. "Yeah," John said, forcing a smile. "I just needed a minute to process everything. It's been a strange day." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Strange? That's an understatement. You've barely said 2 words since you came in." John took a seat at the kitchen table, running his hands through his hair. He knew he couldn't keep avoiding the conversation. Sarah deserved to know what was happening, but how could he explain all the twists and turns of the day? It felt like he was caught in a whirlwind, and the more he tried to understand it, the more confusing it became. "Okay," he said, his voice low. "Here's the deal. I got fired today." Sarah stopped stirring the pot and turned to him, her face filled with confusion. "Wait, what? Fired? But you said it went well. You told me you were meeting with Mr. Carter about a new project, not this." I know," John said quickly, holding up his hands as if to stop her from saying anything else. It was a total shock. One minute he was telling me I was making mistakes, that I wasn't doing enough, and the next thing I knew, he told me I was fired. Just like that, Sarah's face fell, her eyes wide with disbelief. But that's insane, John. You've been working there for years. You've done everything they've asked. You've worked weekends, stayed late, helped out. And this is how they repay you. John nodded, his mind still reeling from the conversation in Mr. Carter's office. It didn't make sense to me either, but there's more. Sarah frowned, sensing that something was off. What do you mean there's more? Apparently, John continued, struggling to find the right words, I wasn't supposed to be fired. The company had actually been planning to promote me. They'd already picked me for a new role, a much better role. But Mr. Carter didn't know about it. He acted without all the facts and— He fired you without even knowing about the promotion? Sarah interrupted, disbelief written all over her face. Exactly, John said, his voice quiet. And then, when I was almost out the door, I got a call from HR. Mark from HR told me everything. The promotion was supposed to be mine. But now Mr. Carter is, well, he's trying to fix it. He's telling me he made a mistake, that I'm going to get the promotion, that everything's going to be okay. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, processing what John had said. That doesn't sound right, John. If they were planning to promote you, why did Carter fire you in the first place? And why wait until now to tell you? Something doesn't add up. Is he just trying to cover his tracks? John felt a chill run through him. He had been thinking the same thing. The more he tried to piece everything together, the more it seemed like Mr. Carter was hiding something. And now, with the way things had gone down, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was being used in a game he didn't fully understand. That's what I don't know, Sarah, he admitted. There's something going on behind the scenes, something Mr. Carter's not telling me. He said things are changing at the company, fast, and he's part of it. But what does that even mean? What's really going on there? Sarah set down the spoon she was holding and walked over to him, her expression softening with concern. John, I know this is a lot to process, but you've got to be careful. If things are as weird as they sound, you might want to think twice before you just walk back into that situation. I know you need this job, but you need to be sure you're not walking into something you can't control. John looked at his wife, feeling the weight of her words. He knew she was right. But there was still this nagging feeling deep in his gut, a sense that things weren't just about a promotion anymore. Something bigger was happening, something that involved more than just him, and he couldn't ignore it. I don't know what's going on, Sarah, he said, his voice tight with frustration, but I can't just walk away from this. If there's a bigger picture, I need to figure out what it is. I don't think I have a choice. Sarah sighed and placed a hand on his shoulder. Just be careful, okay? I don't want you getting hurt in all of this. John nodded, appreciating her concern. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. He couldn't turn back now. Whatever was coming next, he would face it head on. But something told him that the hardest part was yet to come. The next morning, John woke up earlier than usual, his mind already racing with thoughts of the day ahead. He hadn't slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, his brain replayed the conversation with Mr. Carter and the cryptic warnings about things changing. He couldn't shake the feeling that the decision to reinstate him wasn't as simple as it seemed. Why had Mr. Carter fired him in the first place? And why had things been so rushed? His head was full of unanswered questions, and he couldn't afford to let them go unanswered any longer. As John got ready for work, he kept glancing at his phone, hoping for some kind of clarity, some new piece of information that would explain all of this. But there was nothing. No messages, no updates, just silence. It was as if the world was waiting for him to make the next move, and he wasn't sure he even knew what that move was. Sarah had already left for work when he made his way downstairs. He couldn't shake the thought of their conversation last night, how uncertain she'd sounded about everything. She had tried to be supportive, but even she knew that something was off. And deep down, John knew it too. The drive to the office felt longer than usual. The streets were busy with commuters, but John felt like he was in his own bubble. As he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed a few of his co-workers hanging around, talking in small groups. Everyone looked the same, just going through their daily routines, unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. John couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. No one knew what had happened to him the day before. No one knew what he was walking into now. When he stepped into the building, he noticed the shift in the air. People seemed more tense than usual, like there was an underlying current running through the office that everyone was trying to ignore. As he walked past the cubicles, he noticed the whispers. People were looking at him, but no one was saying anything. He didn't know if it was because they were curious about the sudden change, or if they sensed something was wrong. Whatever it was, John could feel it. He felt like an outsider in his own space. As he reached his desk, he saw a familiar face. Claire was standing there, her arms crossed, looking at him with a mix of concern and curiosity. She had always been one of the few people who was kind to him in the office. A little more open, a little more willing to share things others would keep to themselves. But today, her eyes were different. There was a question there, an unspoken worry. "John," she said quietly as she moved closer. "I heard about yesterday. Are you all right? I mean, after what happened with Mr. Carter ... She trailed off, clearly unsure of how to finish her sentence. John gave her a tight smile. "I'm fine," he said, his voice a little too sharp, "just trying to process everything." Claire nodded, but there was still that look in her eyes, as if she knew something he didn't. She glanced over her shoulder before speaking again, lowering her voice. "I don't want to alarm you, but there's talk. People are saying Mr. Carter's been making some strange moves around here, and, well, I think you need to know." John raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" Claire leaned in a little closer, her voice dropping even lower. "I don't know all the details, but I've heard rumors about layoffs, and not just the usual ones. There's talk about the company being sold. There's even some buzz that the higher-ups are bringing in new people to take over management positions. It's like the whole place is about to go through a big shift." John felt a jolt in his chest. A company sale, new management. That didn't sound like the kind of news anyone should be hearing on the down low. And if it was true, it would explain a lot. The tension, Mr. Carter's strange behavior, the sudden firing and reinstating of employees. "Do you know anything more?" John asked, his voice a little more urgent now. Claire shook her head, looking uncomfortable. "Not much, but if you want to know what's really going on, I think you should talk to Mark. He's the one who called you yesterday, right? He's got his ear to the ground, and I think he knows more than he's letting on." John's stomach twisted. Mark from HR, the same guy who had told him that Mr. Carter's decision was a mistake, the same guy who had dropped the bombshell about the promotion. "All right," John said, his voice low. "Thanks for the heads up, Claire. I'll talk to Mark." As Claire walked back to her desk, John sat down at his own, his thoughts racing. Something was definitely going on at ABC Corp, something bigger than just internal politics. And if Claire was right, if there were really whispers about layoffs and a possible sale, then John was standing in the middle of a much bigger storm than he had ever imagined. He had to get to the bottom of it. Whatever was happening at the company, whatever Mr. Carter was hiding, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything. John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He didn't know what Mark was going to say when he talked to him. But whatever it was, John knew one thing for sure. The truth was out there, and he was determined to find it. John spent the rest of the morning in a haze, trying to focus on his tasks, but finding it impossible. Every time he looked at his computer screen, his mind drifted back to the conversation with Claire and her cryptic warning about the rumors floating around the office. Layoffs? A company sale? It was all too much to take in, and it felt like a heavy weight was pressing on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Around noon, he decided he couldn't wait any longer. He needed to talk to Mark. If anyone had the answers, or at least some insight into what was going on, it was him. After all, Mark had been the one who'd reached out to him after Mr. Carter fired him, and if there was a bigger picture at play, Mark was the person who could help him see it. John stood up from his desk, trying to shake off the sense of unease that had settled in his stomach. He walked toward the HR department, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. When he reached Mark's office, he knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," Mark's voice called from inside. John opened the door, stepping into the small, dimly lit office. Mark was sitting at his desk, sorting through some paperwork. He looked up when John entered, his face briefly lighting up with a smile, but it faded quickly as he saw the expression on John's face. "John," Mark said, motioning for him to sit. "What's up? Everything all right?" John didn't waste any time. "I need to know what's going on. I spoke to Claire and she told me there are rumors about layoffs and a company sale. People are talking, Mark, and I need to know if any of it's true." Mark's eyes flickered with something, surprise, maybe even guilt, before he quickly looked down at the papers on his desk, as if trying to avoid eye contact. I can't really talk about that," Mark said, his voice low. "You know how it is. There are things happening behind the scenes and some of it's above my pay grade." John felt his frustration mounting. "Mark, I need the truth. I was fired yesterday, then reinstated today, told I was getting a promotion, and now you're saying you can't tell me what's going on? I'm not buying it." Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He sighed deeply, as if weighing his options. Okay, look, I can't tell you everything, but I can give you a little bit. There are changes happening, big changes. The company has been underperforming in certain areas, and upper management has been scrambling to fix things. There's talk of selling off parts of the business, maybe even selling the whole thing. Some departments are getting downsized, and others are getting restructured. And Carter? Well, he's been under a lot of pressure, more than he's letting on. He's making decisions without all the information, and that's where the mistakes are happening. John felt his chest tighten. Wait, so you're saying Carter didn't even know about the promotion? He didn't know that I was being set up for a bigger role? Mark shook his head, his expression conflicted. Number. He had no idea. They'd been planning to move you up, but Carter didn't get the memo in time. And when he decided to fire you, he thought it was for performance reasons. He didn't know there were bigger plans for you. John processed this slowly, trying to make sense of it all. So Carter hadn't been trying to sabotage him directly. He'd just been ignorant of the company's plans. But why did it feel like there was more to this? Why were all the pieces of this puzzle so out of place? Is this why he's been acting weird? John asked, his voice low. I mean, yesterday when he fired me, he seemed different. It was like he was cold, detached, and now he's suddenly trying to fix everything. Is he under investigation or something? Mark hesitated. I don't know about any investigation, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's something going on with him. He's been making some questionable calls lately, and I've heard whispers that he might be in over his head. I don't think he's the one pulling the strings anymore, John. Whoever is calling the shots, I don't think Carter's fully in control of the direction the company's taking. John leaned back in his chair, trying to absorb everything Mark had just said. It was starting to make sense, but it also opened up more questions. If Mr. Carter wasn't in control, who was? Who was pulling the strings behind the scenes, and what did they want from him? Mark, is there anything else you can tell me? Anything about the future? About what's really happening at the company? John asked, his voice urgent. Mark looked around nervously, as if making sure no one was listening. Listen, John, he said, his voice dropping even lower. There are people at the top who are trying to take the company in a new direction. But it's not all about business. Some of it's personal. There's a power struggle happening right now, and Carter's not the only one who's going to be affected by it. You need to be careful. If you're not careful, you could get caught in the middle of something that's way bigger than you. John sat up straight, the words hitting him harder than he expected. What do you mean, bigger? What kind of power struggle? Mark shook his head, looking down. I don't know all the details. All I know is that there are some big players involved and they're making moves that aren't exactly legal. You've got to be careful who you trust around here. I'm just telling you to watch your back. John's mind was reeling. He had suspected something wasn't right at the company, but now it seemed like the situation was far worse than he could have imagined. A power struggle? Illegal moves? This was no longer just about a promotion. It was about survival. "Thanks, Mark," John said, standing up. "I appreciate you being honest with me, but I need to figure out what to do next." Mark gave him a nervous nod. "Just be careful, John. I'm telling you, things are about to get real messy around here." As John left Mark's office, his thoughts were swirling faster than ever. If there was a power struggle going on at the top, if things were about to get messy, then John had to make a choice. He couldn't just sit back and wait for things to play out. Whatever was coming next, he had to be ready. John spent the next few hours at his desk, trying to act normal, but everything around him felt like it was spinning. Mark's words echoed in his mind. A power struggle, illegal moves, people at the top trying to take the company in a new direction. His gut told him something was wrong, something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. But what could he do? He couldn't just walk away from his job. He had bills to pay, a family to support. He had been loyal to this company, and now he was caught in the middle of a battle for control that he hadn't even known existed. As the afternoon wore on, John's thoughts kept returning to Mr. Carter, the boss who had fired him just the day before and who had then seemed to regret it so quickly. John wasn't sure what to believe anymore. Had Carter been part of the game all along? Or was he just another pawn in a bigger scheme? Was he still trustworthy? John couldn't help but wonder what was really going on behind closed doors, what people weren't saying. There was too much secrecy, too many strange things happening all at once, and yet John knew he couldn't back out now. He had already stepped into something deeper than he had ever expected, and if he was going to survive it, he needed to know more. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen. It was Sarah. "Hey, hun," he answered, trying to sound casual despite the storm swirling in his chest. "John, we need to talk." Sarah's voice came through, sharp with concern. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm starting to feel like you're hiding something from me. You've been acting distant, and I can tell something's not right. What's going on with you and this company?" John's chest tightened. He hated keeping secrets from her. But how could he explain all of this? He didn't even fully understand it himself. Still, he couldn't keep lying. Not to her. "I'll be home soon, Sarah," John said quietly. "There's a lot happening at work. It's complicated. But I'll explain everything, I promise." Sarah hesitated. "John, I'm worried. I know you're under a lot of stress, but I need you to be honest with me. If something's wrong, if you're in danger, or if there's something going on at that job that's not right, I need to know. I'm your wife. We're in this together." John closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. His mind was in 1,000 places at once, but Sarah deserved the truth. He just wasn't sure if he was ready to tell her the whole story. "I know, Sarah," he said softly, "and I will tell you everything. But right now, there's just too much going on. Just give me a little time. I'll come home soon and we'll talk." I promise Sarah didn't say much else. She just wished him a quiet goodbye, and John hung up, feeling the weight of her words heavy on his heart. She was right. He couldn't keep going like this, keeping secrets from her. But everything was unraveling so fast, and he didn't know where it would end. He stared at the screen of his computer, trying to push the feeling of dread down. He had to find out what was going on, no matter the cost. By the time John left the office that evening, his mind was buzzing with unanswered questions and a growing sense of urgency. The drive home felt longer than usual, each passing minute making him feel more and more like he was running out of time. Something big was happening, something that was going to change everything. He could feel it deep in his bones, but he still didn't have the answers. The world outside seemed normal. People driving home from work, kids playing in yards, lights flickering on in windows. But inside John, everything felt different. The tension, the sense of unease. It was suffocating. And as much as he wanted to pretend that everything was fine, he knew it wasn't. Nothing was fine. When he finally walked through the door, Sarah was sitting at the kitchen table, her arms crossed over her chest, waiting for him. She had clearly been expecting him, and the moment he stepped inside, her eyes locked on his. "John," she said softly, her voice calm but with an edge of concern. "We need to talk. Now." John stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at her, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on him. This was it. He couldn't put it off any longer. He had to tell her. But where did he even begin? He walked into the kitchen, dropping his keys on the counter. He sat down across from her, running a hand through his hair. "Sarah, I don't know how to explain this. It's all happening so fast. But I need you to know that I didn't expect any of this." Sarah's face softened a little, but she wasn't backing down. "John, I'm not here to judge you. I'm just worried. I've been hearing things, and I can see how stressed you've been. Something's not right, and I need to understand what's going on." John swallowed hard, the weight of everything crashing down on him all at once. He took a deep breath and started to speak, his words coming slower than he wanted them to. "Yesterday I was fired. Mr. Carter told me I wasn't performing well enough. He said I wasn't cutting it and that I was done. Just like that. But then, something weird happened. I found out that the company was planning to promote me. They had already picked me for a new role. But Mr. Carter didn't know that. And when he fired me, he didn't know about the promotion. And now, well, now I'm in the middle of something bigger than I ever imagined." Sarah's eyes widened as she listened. "You were fired? And then they told you about a promotion? John, that doesn't make any sense." "I know," he said, shaking his head. "But that's not even the strangest part. There's talk about layoffs, and the company might be sold. I've been hearing rumors that there are people at the top trying to take control, and things aren't what they seem. Mark from HR. He told me that Carter isn't in control anymore, and there are people pulling strings behind the scenes. People I don't know." "John," Sarah said, her voice tight with worry, "are you telling me that the company you've worked for all these years is falling apart? Are you really caught in the middle of a power struggle?" John nodded slowly. "I think I am, and I don't know how to get out of it. I'm stuck, Sarah. I don't know who to trust, and I don't know what's going to happen next." Sarah sat in stunned silence for a moment, her hand slowly reaching across the table to squeeze his. "You need to be careful, John. If all of this is really happening, then you're in deeper than you think. You can't just keep walking into that office every day like everything's normal. You have to figure out your next move." John stared down at their hands, feeling the weight of her words. He didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep going down this path without understanding what was really going on. He had to find out who was behind the changes, who was pulling the strings, and he had to be ready for whatever came next. "You're right," he said quietly, looking up at Sarah. "I can't keep pretending everything is fine. I need to get to the bottom of this." The following morning, John felt a sense of urgency that he hadn't experienced in years. He couldn't sit back and let the storm at ABC Corp consume him any longer. Everything was spinning out of control, and while he wasn't sure where it would all lead, he knew he had to take action. The drive to work was quiet, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with every mile. He replayed the conversation with Sarah from the night before in his head. Her words had stuck with him. "You have to figure out your next move." That was the problem. He didn't have a next move. He was caught in the middle of something much bigger than a simple promotion or layoff. Something more dangerous, with people in power pulling strings behind the scenes. But John wasn't about to sit idly by and wait for the inevitable. If this was a game, then he had to figure out how to play it. When he arrived at the office, the atmosphere felt heavy, as if everyone was walking on eggshells. The usual chatter was subdued and people were glancing around nervously, as if waiting for something to happen. John noticed a few unfamiliar faces in the hallway, people who looked like they didn't belong in the building. They were wearing expensive suits, walking with purpose, as if they owned the place. John's heart skipped a beat. Were these the higher-ups Mark had mentioned? The people who were pulling the strings? As John made his way to his desk, he tried to shake off the sense of dread that had settled over him. But as soon as he sat down, he realized there was something different. His computer screen flashed with an email notification from Corporate Relations. It was a generic name, and John's pulse quickened when he saw the subject line. Urgent. Meeting request. Immediate action required. He hesitated for a moment. This could be it. The moment when he found out exactly what was happening behind closed doors. Was he being summoned by the new power players? Or was this just another part of the corporate chess game he was now trapped in? Either way, he couldn't ignore it. He clicked open the email. The message was short, direct. Dear John, you are requested to attend an urgent meeting today at 2 p.m. in the executive conference room. Your presence is required for the discussion regarding your upcoming role and company restructuring. This meeting is crucial to your future here at ABC Corp. Please confirm your attendance at your earliest convenience. Best regards, Corporate Relations Team. John stared at the screen, his mind racing. This was it. He was being called in, probably for the promotion he'd been told about. But could it also be about something else? Was this his chance to finally get some answers about the company's future? He wasn't sure, but he knew he couldn't walk into that room unprepared. The meeting was hours away, but John couldn't sit still. He paced around his desk, thinking about what he knew so far. Rumors of layoffs, a possible company sale, and Mr. Carter's sudden shift in behavior. Everything seemed connected, yet somehow none of it made sense. His phone buzzed again and he glanced at the screen. It was another message from Sarah. I've been thinking about last night. I know you have to do what you think is right, but promise me you'll be careful. This doesn't feel like just a normal work issue. If you need to back out, you can always walk away. Don't risk everything for a job. John felt a pang in his chest. He knew she was worried, but he couldn't turn back now. He had come this far, and backing out wasn't an option. He had to see this through. As the clock ticked toward 2 p.m., John felt a rising sense of dread in his stomach. The tension in the office had only gotten worse, and the moment the hour arrived, he stood up from his desk, his legs feeling heavier with every step. The executive conference room was on the top floor, tucked away from the rest of the building, giving it an air of secrecy. As John walked toward the elevator, his mind was racing. What was waiting for him in that room? More answers? More lies? He didn't know, but one thing was clear. This meeting would change everything. The elevator ride seemed to take forever. The doors slid open on the top floor, and John stepped out into a sleek, polished hallway, a stark contrast to the rest of the office. This was the heart of the company, where the real decisions were made. He walked down the hall to the conference room, his palms sweating despite the cool air around him. When he entered the room, he was immediately greeted by a few unfamiliar faces. They were seated around a large oval table, all wearing suits that looked like they cost more than John's monthly rent. A woman in her early 40s stood up to shake his hand. She was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that made John immediately aware of her power in the room. Mr. John Harris, she said, her voice smooth but commanding. We're glad you could join us today. Please have a seat. John took the seat at the end of the table, his mind racing as he tried to keep his composure. He recognized none of the people around the table, though a few of them gave him looks that made him uncomfortable. As he sat down, the woman who had greeted him continued, I'll get straight to the point. You've been selected for a new position here at ABC Corp, one that will put you at the center of the changes happening within the company. But before we go into the specifics, we need to discuss some of the recent decisions that have been made regarding your role, as well as some other matters that concern your future here. John's heart began to race. This was it. They were finally going to tell him what was really going on. But as the woman continued speaking, something about her words didn't sit right. Let's start with the firing, she said, glancing at a man seated next to her, who slid a folder toward John. The decision to fire you was made quickly, and without full knowledge of the situation. That was a mistake. However, in light of your potential, we are offering you a new role, one that will make you a key player in the company's restructuring. But understand, John, that this comes with conditions. You will need to prove your loyalty to the new direction we're taking." John's mind was spinning. A new role? Conditions? The words felt heavy, like they carried more weight than just a job offer. What were they asking him to do? What did proving his loyalty really mean? The woman continued, her eyes cold. "We need someone who is willing to align with our vision and do whatever is necessary to ensure the success of this transition. This is not a time for hesitation. Do you understand?" John's throat went dry. He nodded slowly, but inside, the alarms were ringing. This wasn't just about a promotion anymore. He was being pulled into something much bigger and much darker than he had ever imagined. John sat there, his mind racing, trying to process what the woman was saying. Prove your loyalty? The words echoed in his mind, each syllable more unsettling than the last. His thoughts were clouded, the weight of the situation pressing on him with every passing second. This wasn't just about a promotion anymore. This wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder. This was about survival. The woman continued, her voice steady but cold, as if she were explaining something that should have already been clear to him. In this new role, you will have access to information and resources that are critical to the company's future. We're entering a transitional phase, John. And during this phase, we need leaders who are not afraid to make tough decisions. She paused, as if waiting for him to respond. John swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. He had come into this meeting hoping to get answers, to understand what was really happening at ABC Corp. But now it felt like he had stumbled into a game where the rules were being made up on the spot. "Let me be clear," the woman continued, leaning forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "There are forces at play within the company that you don't fully understand. People are trying to reshape this business, and not everyone will make it through the changes. You have the potential to lead, but you need to choose your alliances wisely. This is a time for action, not hesitation." John felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't the job he had signed up for. This wasn't just about climbing the corporate ladder. This was about choosing sides in a battle he hadn't even known existed. And he was being asked to make that decision in an instant. "How do I know who to trust?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "That, John, is something you'll have to figure out for yourself. But trust me, the right choice will become clear soon enough." John looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the other people gathered at the table. None of them spoke, but the silence between them was heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand, with every move having the potential to make or break his future. But he wasn't a fool. He knew one thing for sure. The people in this room were not on his side. They were part of something bigger, and John was being pulled into the middle of it whether he liked it or not. "You'll have the opportunity to prove yourself starting today," the woman said, her tone final. "We'll be monitoring your performance closely. Don't disappoint us, John." With that, she stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. The others followed suit, standing and leaving the room without a word. John remained seated for a moment, trying to process everything he had just heard. Prove yourself. Choose your alliances wisely. It felt like a game, but the stakes were higher than anything he had ever imagined. He stood up slowly, his mind spinning with questions. What had he just gotten himself into? Who were these people really? And most importantly, what were they planning? John left the conference room, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more disturbing than the last. He had walked into that meeting thinking it was a simple conversation about his promotion. But now he felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, with no idea which way to jump. As he walked back to his desk, the silence in the office seemed louder than ever. The air was thick with tension, and everyone seemed to be going about their work as if nothing had changed. But John knew better. He knew that the game had changed, and now he was in the middle of it. He sat down at his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he opened his email inbox. There were dozens of unread messages, but one in particular caught his eye. It was from Claire. "John, I'm worried about you. I've been hearing things, and I don't think you're being told the whole story. Be careful. Trust no one." The message sent a chill down John's spine. Claire had always been the kind of person who knew more than she let on, and now it seemed like she was warning him about something bigger than the promotions, the layoffs, or the corporate restructuring. John stared at the message for a long moment, weighing his options. Claire had been one of the few people in the office who seemed to care about him. But could he trust her? What if she was just another player in the game? His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Sarah. "John, please, I'm really worried. Please come home soon and talk to me. Something doesn't feel right." John's chest tightened. He hadn't told Sarah everything, but she had known something was off. He couldn't keep hiding this from her. She deserved to know the truth, even if the truth scared him. But now, with everything happening so fast, John didn't know if he could protect her from whatever was coming. If things were as bad as they seemed, could he really keep her safe? And more importantly, could he keep himself safe? As he sat there, staring at his phone, John felt the weight of the decisions ahead of him. The game had changed, and the choices he made now would determine the rest of his life. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. This wasn't just about a job anymore. It was about survival. And if he was going to make it out of this, he needed to be smart. He needed to make the right moves. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. The clock was ticking. By the time John left the office that day, his head was swimming with thoughts. The meeting had left him shaken more than he cared to admit. The woman from corporate, the veiled threats, the subtle pressure to prove his loyalty. Everything about it felt wrong. But now more than ever, he realized how deeply he was embedded in something that went far beyond simple office politics. As he got into his car, the world outside felt muted, as if he was seeing it through a fog. Every step he took, every move he made felt calculated, like he was walking through a maze, and each choice he made could lead him deeper into danger or offer him a way out. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. "Where are you? I'm really scared, John. Please come home." John's heart clenched. She was worried. He knew she was, but he hadn't even begun to figure out how to protect her, or even protect himself. He couldn't tell her the whole truth. Not yet. He wasn't ready. But he knew he couldn't keep going like this. Something had to give. He pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward home. But as he drove, his mind kept drifting back to the office. The power players, the people pulling the strings behind the scenes. Who were they? What did they want from him? And why had they picked him? John didn't know how long he sat at a red light, lost in thought. But when it changed, he started driving again, his grip on the steering wheel tight, the road ahead of him feeling more uncertain with every mile. He needed answers. He needed to know who was behind all of this, and why they had targeted him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the answers might come at a price. The deeper he dug, the more dangerous it would become. And there was no turning back. John arrived home just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the driveway. The house felt quieter than usual, the familiar warmth of home now tinged with a sense of unease. He parked the car and took a deep breath before stepping out, trying to steady his nerves. As he walked to the front door, his mind raced through the events of the day, the meeting, the warnings, the heavy weight of the decisions hanging over him. When he stepped inside, Sarah was waiting for him in the living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She didn't look angry, just scared. Her eyes locked onto his as soon as he walked through the door, searching his face for any signs of what had happened. "John," she said softly, but with an edge of urgency in her voice. "What's going on? I can't keep pretending like everything's fine. You're not the same. Please, talk to me." John stood there for a moment, looking at her, trying to gather his thoughts. The weight of everything, the secrecy, the danger, the choices he had to make, felt like it was too much to carry. And yet, he knew that hiding it from Sarah wasn't an option anymore. She deserved the truth. He sat down beside her on the couch, taking her hands in his. "Sarah, I'm sorry I haven't been honest with you. But everything has changed. It's not just about the promotion. There's so much more happening at the company, and I've been caught up in something I didn't even know existed." She stared at him, her eyes wide. "What do you mean? What's really going on?" John took a deep breath, trying to explain it as best as he could. "I went into that meeting today thinking I was just going to be given the promotion they promised me, but it was more than that. They told me they wanted me to be part of a bigger shift happening at the company. They said I have the potential to lead, but it comes with conditions, loyalty to the new direction they're taking. The problem is, I don't trust them. I don't know who's behind all of this, or what they want from me." Sarah looked at him, concern written all over her face. "John, that sounds dangerous. You're not just dealing with office politics here. You're talking about people who want to control everything, and you're caught in the middle of it." "I know," John said, his voice tight, "and it's only getting worse. I've been hearing rumors about a company sale, layoffs, power struggles. There are people in that office I don't know, people who are pulling the strings behind the scenes. I don't know who to trust anymore, and I don't know what it means for us." Sarah sat back, her face pale. "So what now? What do you do? You can't just keep working for people like that, John. It's dangerous." John's heart sank. He knew she was right, but what other choice did he have? He couldn't walk away from everything, not without knowing the full truth. "I don't know, Sarah, but I have to figure it out. I have to know who's really in control, what they want from me, and how deep this really goes. If I'm going to survive this, I need to play the game. But I can't do it alone." She reached over and took his hand, squeezing it tightly. "Then we'll do this together. But promise me, John, promise me you'll be careful. You're not just dealing with a job anymore. You're dealing with people who will stop at nothing to get what they want." John nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. "I promise I'll be careful." But deep down, he knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were dangers lurking in the shadows, and he had already taken a step into a world where trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The game he had been pulled into was bigger than anything he could have imagined. And now, he had no choice but to play. As he sat there beside Sarah, the only thing that kept him grounded was the feeling that, no matter how dark this path became, he wasn't facing it alone. And that might be the only thing that could save him. The truth was out there, but it was buried deep, and John wasn't going to stop until he unearthed it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.